So I appreciate Richard's patience. Richard should have been speaking to you about half an hour ago, and we were going to have quite a long chat, and he's very kindly agreed that we will shorten our chat to get us back on time. But Richard Hanson-Granville has taken funding, as I mentioned, from one of these public sector organisations in the UK, and he's going to tell us a little bit about how that was and where it's left his organisation that's open source. Richard, do you want to come up to the stage and we can talk a bit more? I'm assuming you've got a mic on and that it's working.
I'm not sure it's working. Yeah.
Is it working?
Hello?
Are you alive?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I think you're both working and alive. So Heatweb, tell me a little bit about Heatweb as a company.
Heatweb.
Sorry, I keep
It's all right.
Web. You'll never get me to change.
We're a consultancy at the moment. We started off as we're probably one of the oldest manufacturers of heating equipment for thermal stores and hot water cylinders and heating equipment. We rebooted last year as a consultancy, focusing on getting to net zero and quality control in the heating industry.
So the heating industry, you're talking plumbing?
It's plumbing. It's plumbing at the basic level, but it's more to do with heat networks.
Open source and plumbing?
So communal heating. We're talking open source, all about community stuff here. So a lot of the people in this room will be living in blocks of flats. They'll probably have a central boiler system. So we do a lot of the looking at these systems. So if you extrapolate the findings, probably we could save half of the people in this room half of their energy bills quite easily just by adding a layer of visibility to the existing infrastructure, adding some quality control, because the average heating system.
How does open source feed into that?
So it's about quality control. So if you have a system that doesn't work, you have to be able to see it doesn't work to fix it. If you install a zero carbon system and it turns out wasting more carbon than it was originally intended, unless you can see it, that goes unnoticed. So everything in the heating world is going unnoticed. But there are MQTT functions in every BMS system.
MQTT?
Message telemetry and transport. Message queuing, telemetry and transport. So it's one of the IoT baseline protocols.
Okay.
So if we combine that with other open source software such as Postgre databasing and Grafana for visibility, we can pretty much turn on visibility on all these energy systems overnight. And so we can suddenly see all of these faults and problems and address them for the first time.
Right, so you're going to address these faults and problems for the first time and create visibility by building on top of open source software.
Yeah. By using the best of open source that's out there. So we're not trying to start a brand new open source project. We're trying to utilize the existing open source, which is good enough as it is to do the task in hand, and actually combine the technologies to create a system that provides quality control for any type of heating system or energy system.
We have a phrase that gets overused in open source about standing on the shoulders of giants. So effectively, what you're saying is that your relatively diminutive UK business has been able to stand on the shoulders of Grafana and Postgres to build out something.
Not quite. It's a bit of a partnership. So we might do it, but we wrote all the regulations. So we have an exceptional level of technical knowledge in the heating world.
Yeah.
It's impossible to fix these systems without that. There's no one from the open source world can fix a heating system because they don't know how a boiler works, for example. So you need a partnership.
You don't know that.
You need a partnership between engineering experts in the hydraulics world and open source experts in the software world. So we have tried to create open source software as best as we can to do what we've done, and it works. So I'm going out daily saving tons and tons of carbon by installing open source libraries that we've published on GitHub. So we're kind of like not just trying to create an open source, we're actually using open source to save carbon, tons of it daily. So it's a real targeted, it's what we see a lot of the point of open source is for. Open source is, the next mission of open source is to save carbon, get to net zero, and there's probably things about currency systems, the next money supply. There's a few social things where open source is the solution, but it requires the experts in those fields to work to direct the open source world as to what they need them to help them with.
So you're talking collaboration.
Pure collaboration between software world and engineering worlds, which doesn't happen at the moment because there's very little central direction. They kind of scatter money around to projects, hoping someone's going to come up with a solution, whereas it's not. The solution's there, you just need to put them together.
Right. Let's just pause there and go back to that. You said they're scattering money around. They scattered some of that money your way.
They did, yes.
So how much did they give you,
so
and what did they give you it for?
We got £250,000 to develop what we effectively did is we developed a bit of hardware. It's a hat for a Raspberry Pi. So we've basically made it so you can use a Raspberry Pi to control any heating hot water system, to do all these. So that was the bit we needed to actually get into some sites to implement some stuff. There was libraries. It was the cloud infrastructure to provide the visibility on top of that,
right.
and then
So
to run field trials.
Just sticking with the funding, so they gave you £250,000 to do a project that had to be open source. Is that right? I think the grant
was part
specific.
of the open source,
Okay.
yes.
Right.
Yes.
The
So it's
grant was
open source,
specific.
using open source to achieve net zero.
Right, and I think they gave 6 projects money at the time, so it wasn't just you.
Yeah.
So that money, what did it allow you to do specifically?
It allowed us to develop and get CE approved a hat for Raspberry Pi.
Yeah.
So effectively we've got the hardware in place, and now we can do anything without licenses and control and visibility. We created it was a lot of research on and just writing the cloud infrastructure, just spending the time being able to go through it and try stuff out. A lot of the money went on field trials, so we ran 6 or 7 field trials, which is like the world's first CO2 heat pump system.
Yeah.
So it's real engineering advances were made. We might not have pushed the boundaries of open source forwards, but we got some world's first CO2 heat pump. We got the Barbican Centre, the Excel Centre. We've done Birmingham City, Southampton City. Vast amounts of energy.
Big achievements.
So we're saving costs.
You've
really
achieved a lot, and you're not just
stuff.
achieving a lot in terms of business scale, but you're achieving a lot with purpose that Will was also talking about before.
Yeah.
So tell me about your community manager, your community engagement, and all the contributions that you're bringing in from open source now.
So I read the book you
read the book?
I read the book you told me to read. I think it's in there.
I wouldn't have read all of it.
Yeah, that one there. People
Powered, John O'Baker.
I did have to admit, I kind of gave up halfway through because it wasn't Greek. It was kind of not.
Don't critique Jono's book.
No, we were.
I'll never hear the end of it.
It for your world it's great. For us as engineers trying to, trying to get general public to join up to a GitHub project, which they have got no. You might be saving half of your heating bills, but it wouldn't be able to contribute. It would be like, we'd love it if these guys put it in our building, but I can't really. So we couldn't engage with anyone. We got.
So stop there.
Zero engagement.
So you've got zero engagement. You had £250,000. You've created a project, and there's zero engagement. So the code is on GitHub?
The code is on GitHub. We did an original project, and now we're doing a new one, which is boiling it down so there's just data on there. So it's the data and the Postgre functions that you need to import to systems to get them live. So it's not really dependency. It's just raw. What you need to do the job on the day kind of toolbox.
So let's move away a little bit from what it does, but focus and home in on what we achieved with that money in terms of open source. So you were required to put it on GitHub?
Wasn't that specific, I don't think, but it was an open source project.
Right,
yeah.
But what did that mean? What was making it an open source project?
The fact that we put it on GitHub with Apache 2 licenses, so the knowledge the expertise knowledge that we have from the heating world has gone onto GitHub. So the heating functions that you need to say, put a statistic on Grafana, a little dashboard, red, green or yellow, it works, it doesn't work. That code is on GitHub.
The code is there with the license. You've read half of People Powered. Do you have a community manager? Do you have community engagement?
No, we're an engineering company. We do plumbing on a daily basis. This is a different world to us.
Yeah. So I think that you had some thoughts about where that's left you, because you've been funded to create an open source project. You've created a project that has a lot of potential, but doesn't have engagement, doesn't have contribution. So what's happening now with that engagement with the funders?
Heating engineers and consultants are using the GitHub site to fix heating systems.
Right.
But it would be a lot. It could be improved considerably if some software people got involved in the project, because it's got things like quality control forms, which would, there's elements of software that could really be improved. But there's no one in the open source world. It's not one's going to unicorn and make £1 million out of quality controlling a system. It sits in this world which is kind of unattractive.
I honestly don't think that's your issue, because these people build infrastructure, right? They're not really looking for the sexy top-end project. I think the issue is that when you were given that money, you weren't given an explanation of open source, you didn't come from an open source background, and you didn't know that if you build it, they will not come. Because magically, people will look at thousands and thousands of GitHub projects. They will go to the ones that people are aware of. They'll go to the ones they've seen at the conferences. They'll go to the ones where the community managers have been out there. And it really, to me, shows the value that sometimes we overlook. I don't think she's here, but there's a lady at the Turing Institute who did a really nice post this week about community managers and the engagement, Malvika from the Turing Way, talking about how often the community manager role is undervalued. And I think what you do is give us the perfect example of a project that I imagine everybody in this room is thinking, that is brilliant. To reuse and recycle open source to create something that will create carbon efficiency at the level of utilization that my local plumber is going to use it is brilliant. You're creating something that every plumber in the country could effectively use because it's open, except you don't have a community around you to support you, to build more contribution, to help you maintain it, to deal with any bug fixes, to deal with anything that goes wrong with it.
No, we would have been, if it was, we would have benefited most from having, if the government was serious about using open source to get to net zero, they should have some experts in open source working to that goal that can help. If they're giving us $250,000, they could at least have someone up there that, I mean, no one's actually looked at the output of the project at the government level, not a single person. It's because it's like, gave the money, did the project good, the end of the story. It's like, hang on, there's a goal here, which is to get to net zero. There's no support in actually achieving the goal. It was more like a competition. Can you do open source? It's like, well, that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to save carbon.
But that's it. Well, but you were given funding to do open source to save carbon.
Yeah.
And that's the issue, I think, is that you can do open source depending on what you think open source is. And if it's just putting the code on GitHub, I call it a fly pass, because you dump the code and then you fly past.
It's not a fly pass because it's well maintained and well, we're maintaining it.
You have a lovely repository. I have had a look at
We are properly maintaining it because we're using it day and we're evolving it day after day after day. We import a new function, we get something else working, it goes on there. So someone else can do it if they wanted to, but it's getting that kind of, it's in a dark room kind of thing, whereas it's potentially. Yeah.
So I'm going to do 2 quick fire questions for you to bring this to an end so that we get back on time, but also because I really want to draw these out because I think the conversation and the story you've had is fascinating. So the other projects, there were 6 of you. Are any of the other projects actually engaged?
I'm not sure. We did try initially. So when we thought open source, great. So I sort of contacted the other groups with the thinking that we could all, maybe we're all in an open source thing, we can collaborate together. But it all fell a bit in silos. Everyone had their little pet project and there was no, our kind of view is they should try and build a tree and everyone should be given like missions to build branches, not to go and create another plant and plant over there. So you end up with a field of little plants. It was kind of one of the government to go net zero, open source. That's the mission, right? We need to get that bit done, and build on it.
Right, and how did you get there? So you had 6 disparate projects that were each given $250K to do open source. They've all gone and done their own thing. We're not aware that any of them have now been adopted or supported by the community. What can the public sector, the government, what can those funding technology and in particular open source do in your mind to make it work better in the future?
They could have someone in government that is interested in something other than just handing out the money. Because that seems to be entirely what it's driven about. It's like, we have money to give out for open source, and we want to get to net zero, and we want to do this and that, but there is no central thinking, no planning, there is nothing to coalesce around on a sort of communal, because if it's communal systems, communal energy, it's got to be government driven. It's like Ofgem and all these lot. So it's like, well, there doesn't seem to be, no one's even seen the output of our project. The fact that we've saved 50,000 tonnes of carbon in the city and we could do it tomorrow, you'd think someone would be interested, but we were dealing with people who were funding open source projects. They've got nothing to do with zero carbon.
And I think
they're certainly interested in the outputs. So
the future goes back to the few words I was saying before we sat down together. The future is that we need to support our public sector in their utilisation of open source in our infrastructure, but also in how they fund it, to help them to build a better understanding of what it is they're funding and how to get the best outcomes from it, to create that public code that really can be utilised and reused and coalesce communities. Richard, thank you so much for your candour and coming and talking to us about this today. I can guarantee you, because we're going to be doing some work with some of the funders, that this will be shared with them, this video afterwards, and we will maybe come back to you if we can and talk to you a bit more about it. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.